Hello class, welcome. This week's lesson is about consequentialism and the principle of utility. I'd like you to begin by recalling last week's lesson when we looked at the trolley car problem. And in the trolley car problem, we're asked to make a decision between killing one person and killing four. And in some versions of the trolley car problem, most people have the intuition that the right thing to do is to divert the trolley car off onto the sidetrack to avoid running over and killing four people and run over and kill the one instead. And usually they give a sort of a justification like this, that in a tragic dilemma like that, the right course of action is the one that results in the least loss of life. That it's better that the one should die so that the four could live. That way of thinking about ethics is called consequentialism, according to which the right thing to do is the thing that has the best consequences. In other versions of the trolley car problem, people hesitate to endorse the same principle. So most people are unwilling to push a fat guy off the bridge to his death in order to save four people tied to the tracks. And most people are unwilling to kill a healthy patient to save four sick patients. That is, even though killing the one would save the four, people think that it's somehow morally wrong to kill the one to save the four in those cases, and they usually appeal to some other kind of moral reason. They'll say something like, if you push the fat guy off the bridge, that's murder. Or if you kill the healthy patient to save the sick patient, that's a violation of the patient's rights. And that way of thinking about morality, that morality is not about the consequences of our actions, but instead about the rules. That is, murder is against the rules. It's against the moral law. It's in the category of things that are wrong. It's categorically wrong. That way of thinking about ethics is called deontological. And for the deontologist, morality is not about the consequences of our actions. Instead, morality is primarily a matter of rights and obligations. And a great deal of the debate in contemporary ethics is about this controversy or conflict between consequentialist views of morality and deontological views of morality. And we'll be talking about those for the next couple weeks. Today's lesson is about consequentialism, the idea that the right thing to do is the thing that has the best consequences or the best results. Consequentialism used to be called utilitarianism. And still the main brand of consequentialism is utilitarianism. So today we're going to learn about utilitarianism. Well, utilitarianism is the consequentialist moral theory based on the principle of utility. This is the principle of utility. It's one of the most important things you'll learn in this course. One of the most influential ideas in modern moral philosophy. In fact, I would say if you don't know about utilitarianism, you don't know the first thing about modern moral philosophy. So, okay, without further ado, here is the principle of utility. The principle of utility says the morally right thing to do is the action that results in the most happiness and least unhappiness for the greatest number of people. There are three key ideas in the principle of utility. One, morality is about the results of our actions. Two, the results that we want are as much happiness and as little unhappiness as possible. And three, each person's happiness gets equal consideration. So we'll take those one by one. First, the right thing to do is the thing that has the best results. That's called consequentialism. The consequentialist says that morality is primarily a matter of the consequences of our actions. The thing that we ought to do morally is the thing that will have the best results. And so those of us who opted to turn the trolley car off onto the sidetrack to kill the one, to avoid killing the four, made an appeal to the consequences. We said that given the tragic dilemma, the right thing to do was the thing that had the best consequences, that resulted in the least loss of life. So that's what consequentialism is. It's the idea that morality is primarily a matter of the consequences of our actions. Utilitarianism is teleological. That is, the utilitarian says that morality has a telos, or a purpose, or a goal. So morality is entirely forward-looking for the consequentialist. That is, if the consequentialist is correct, when we're trying to determine or assess the morality of our conduct, all the morally relevant facts are in the future. Morality is about acting in such a way as to produce the best possible future. Okay, so that's consequentialism. Oh, I should tell you this too. Nowadays, people will use the terms consequentialism and utilitarianism more or less interchangeably. That is, unless somebody tells you otherwise, when they're talking about consequentialism, probably what they have in mind is what we used to call utilitarianism. And our textbook author actually uses the term consequentialism. I kind of like the old-fashioned term utilitarianism better, but you'll see those used sort of interchangeably. It's actually kind of a funny thing. The term consequentialism was originally coined by a philosopher named Elizabeth Anscombe, who was very much a critic of utilitarianism. She said it was, morally bankrupt. Or maybe she used the word repugnant, something like that. But anyway, for whatever reason, we've all adopted Elizabeth Anscombe's name for utilitarianism, and so, okay. Anyway, first key idea in utilitarianism is that morality is about the consequences of our actions. It's about the results of our actions. That's consequentialism. So the next thing is the theory of value. And what the utilitarian says is what's ultimately valuable is happiness or pleasure, or the prevention of unhappiness or suffering or misery. And so the second key idea here is that the thing we ought to do is the thing that results in the most happiness and least unhappiness. I would call that hedonism. So hedonism is the idea that happiness or pleasure is good and unhappiness or pain is bad. And so morality is about promoting happiness in the future and preventing suffering in the future. Some of you might understand the word hedonism to have a sort of a negative connotation. That is, hedonism implies pleasure seeking and pain avoiding. That's what animals do. They seek pleasure and avoid pain. You might think that human beings are better than that in some way. In fact, the utilitarian philosopher John Stuart Mill, in addressing this point, says that hedonism is the doctrine of swine, that it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. It's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So if you think happiness is good and unhappiness is bad, it's very hard to explain why you're better off being an unhappy Socrates than a happy fool, or an unhappy human being than a happy pig. And you might also think, like, look, sometimes happiness is bad. I mean, if you think about, like, somebody who's having a manic episode, they're very happy, but it's not exactly a good thing. They're prone to bad decisions. Or if you think about, maybe you're a Marine and you think, look, pain is weakness leaving the body. Or so you can imagine cases where pleasure is actually bad or pain is actually good. And that, indeed, that's going to be one of the main criticisms of utilitarianism. But I would say this in defense of the hedonist. If you're looking for a solution to the problem of objectivity in ethics, this is a pretty good one. Really, if you think about it, in this course, the only other solution we've seen to the problem of objectivity in ethics so far has been a religious solution. That is, God is the moral lawgiver. But if you want a secular solution to the problem of objectivity in ethics, it's hard to think of one that would be much better than this. I think it's more plausible if you construe it not as, if you construe morality not as being about promoting happiness, but instead about preventing suffering. And so here's an entirely secular basis for an objective morality. Suffering is real. I take it, that's obvious. In fact, it's interesting because this point about suffering is very much part of like the world's wisdom tradition. So, there's 4 noble truths of Buddhism. The first noble truth of Buddhism is that life is suffering. Or, maybe you come from a Christian tradition. Well, the central figure of Christianity is like a morally perfect person who was made to suffer the ultimate injustice. And so, okay. If you go back to anything in the Abrahamic traditions, like humanity begins with a fall from Eden into, that is, we live in a fallen world of suffering. And so, okay, suffering is sort of obvious, right? And suffering is real. And so, okay, that's just a fact. And now you do have to make a value judgment here, but it's one that nobody in their right mind would deny, which is that suffering is bad. That the world would be better if there was less of it. You might think to deny that suffering is bad in some sort of philosophical sense, like maybe in the context of a philosophy classroom when you're being very skeptical. You might construe some kind of argument where, actually sometimes suffering is good because it makes us stronger or something. But in reality, everybody knows suffering is bad, especially if you are suffering. Like if you have like a toothache or a headache, you know that your suffering is bad and that the world would be better if it would stop. Okay, so, and this is hedonism. It's the idea that suffering is bad. And I would say, if you want a secular solution to the problem of objectivity in ethics, this is a pretty good one. Okay, so utilitarianism is consequentialist because it says that the right thing to do is the thing that has the best results, and it's hedonistic because it says that happiness and pleasure are good, and unhappiness and pain are bad. Now, the third thing to know about utilitarianism is whose happiness counts. And what the utilitarian says is, well, everybody's happiness counts. I have to do that in a different color, forgive me. So this is impartiality. Utilitarianism is an impartial moral theory because it says everybody counts the same. So it's sort of democratic. It's egalitarian. It says every person has equal value. It says each person's happiness gets equal consideration. So my happiness doesn't count for any more or any less than yours. Your happiness doesn't count for any more or any less than your classmates. Your classmates' happiness doesn't count for any more or any less than the poor children in sub-Saharan Africa. Their happiness doesn't count for any more or any less than the people in the Gaza Strip. Their happiness doesn't count for any more or any less than the poor people in the Ukraine, and so on and so forth. Every person's happiness gets equal consideration. So earlier in the semester, we looked at ethical egoism. And we saw the debate between the egoist, who says you should do what's in your own interest, and the altruist, who said that you should do what's in the interest of others. Utilitarianism is more like altruism than egoism, because it is about doing what's best for the most people. But there's a subtle difference, I think, between utilitarianism and altruism, because in altruism, you're supposed to sacrifice of yourself for the good of others. Whereas in utilitarianism, you get just as much consideration as everybody else. But of course, there's a lot more of everybody else than there is of you. And so it's more like altruism, but slightly different. Okay, so Impartiality says each person's happiness gets equal consideration. Okay, so this is utilitarianism. The right thing to do is the thing that results, and that's consequentialism. And the most happiness and least unhappiness, that's hedonism. For the greatest number of people, that's impartiality. Sometimes you'll see this called the greatest happiness principle, often summarized with the phrase, the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, the next thing I have to do is try to give you some kind of a defense of utilitarianism. Why there are so many smart people who take this theory very seriously. And I find that the best way to do this actually is to give you just a little bit of the history of the theory, the philosophers who defended it, and what they believed in. That is, I think once you understand what the utilitarians are all about, you'll understand the strengths of the consequentialist position. So let's get into that. So I'm going to talk about the major utilitarian philosophers. I'm going to talk to you about three of them. First one is Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was an 18th century English philosopher, and the principle of utility was really his idea. He was a social reformer, a social activist, a progressive thinker, really a revolutionary thinker ahead of his time. So you have to understand the 18th century, we're talking about the 1700s. 250 years before women got the vote, 100 years before slavery was abolished. And at this time, Jeremy Bentham was advocating for the abolition of slavery. Really one of the first English philosophers to advocate for the abolition of slavery. Jeremy Bentham also thought that people should be able to get divorced if they were in unhappy marriages, which seems kind of obvious to us now, but was a revolutionary idea in the 18th century. Jeremy Bentham also thought that homosexuals should be allowed to live as they wish as long as they're not hurting anybody else, which again, to us, seems reasonable, but was worse than controversial in the 18th century. In fact, Jeremy Bentham had friends who advised him against publishing his thoughts about homosexuality because of the damage it would do to his reputation. And so he was a revolutionary social reformer well ahead of his time. And he was the first utilitarian. Kind of an eccentric, too. Sometime, if you're interested, you can look this up on the internet. You can just Google Jeremy Bentham and his cats. Fascinating story. I don't have time for it. Okay, next one. John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was really the most important and influential of the utilitarian philosophers. He was a 19th century English philosopher, part of the liberal tradition. Here, liberal has to do with liberty. It has to do with freedom. So you probably said the Pledge of Allegiance in school, and you remember the lines. Liberty and justice for all, that's liberalism. And so John Stuart Mill was a believer in liberalism in that sense. He believed in freedom and equality. He wrote a book called On Liberty. which is really one of the great philosophical defenses of liberalism. And what he argued for in On Liberty is that people should be free to pursue their own happiness with almost no limits. That really the only limit on your liberty or your freedom to pursue your happiness is when it impedes on the rights of others to do the same. That is, the limit of your freedom is when you start hurting other people. I had a professor once who explained it to me this way, that my freedom to swing my fist ends where your face begins. Okay, so that's On Liberty. If you're interested in freedom of speech, the second chapter of On Liberty has a wonderful defense of freedom of thought and freedom of discussion. Basically what he argues for in chapter 2 of On Liberty, he says censorship is wrong because it prevents the growth of knowledge. That is, or freedom of thought and freedom of speech is good because it promotes the growth of knowledge. And he has a great argument. It's worth going through because it gives you an idea of the way John Stuart Mill's mind works. He said, so if you think about somebody who you would want to censor, somebody who has an unpopular view, an unorthodox view, maybe what you think is a dangerous or harmful view, well, one of three things will be the case about the person you want to censor. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong, or maybe he's partly right and partly wrong. In any case, Mills says censoring him or silencing him would prevent the growth of knowledge. So, first of all, obviously, in the case where the person you want to censor is telling the truth, it would be a mistake to silence him because you are thereby depriving society of the opportunity of exchanging error for the truth. That is, he knows something the rest of us don't. You would be in the position of the Inquisition silencing Galileo. Really a great embarrassment to the Catholic Church that they made Galileo renounce the obviously correct, well, what we now know is obviously correct position that the Earth orbited the sun, not the other way around. Okay, and so you don't want to be the Inquisition silencing Galileo, and if you censor somebody who's telling the truth, that's what you would be doing. So clearly that's wrong. But then why shouldn't you censor somebody who's saying something that's false? Why shouldn't you censor the purveyor of misinformation or disinformation? Well, Mills says still, if you silence somebody who's wrong, you're still preventing the growth of knowledge. Because, well, for one thing, you're depriving that person of the opportunity of exchanging error for the truth. Because if you listen to him and find out what he's getting wrong, then you can correct him. And if you correct him, then he has the chance to change his mind. And his knowledge will grow. But it's more than that. In the process of correcting him, you can be more confident in the truth of the popular opinion. That is, for Mill, the question, why shouldn't we censor somebody who's wrong, is a little bit like the question, why should a guilty person get a defense? Well, the reason we give a guilty person a defense is to make sure that they're guilty. And the reason we give an incorrect opinion a hearing is to make sure that it's incorrect. And then Mill says, of course, the third possibility is the most likely one, which is that when people disagree, it's not because one of them's right and the other's wrong. It's because they share the truth between them. If they don't silence each other, they can listen to each other and learn from each other, and both gain knowledge. Okay, so that's Mill's argument for free speech. It's a good one, but the thing to notice here for today's lesson is the utilitarian nature of his argument. That is, he's not saying that you have a God-given right to free speech. He's not saying that censorship is a violation of somebody's rights or it's against the rules. He's saying that censorship is wrong because it has a negative consequence. It prevents the growth of knowledge. You see, so it's a straightforward consequentialist moral justification of the freedom of speech. Okay, so that's one great example. There's so many. Another one that's probably worth mentioning Mill wrote a book on the subjection of women, which is, it's a work of feminist philosophy. It's an argument for women's liberation. Keep in mind, Mill is writing in the 19th century, mid-1800s, 5 or 6 decades before women got the vote. And he argued that women should have the same rights and opportunities as men. They should be able to participate in the public life. They should be able to vote. They should be able to hold public office. They should be able to go to university. They should be able to become doctors and lawyers, and same as men. And that our society was doing a real harm by, well, preventing women from pursuing their happiness in the same way as men. And again, Mill's argument here is instructive. He considers the person who would want to deprive women of the same opportunities as men. That is, what would your average 19th century misogynist say to the idea that women should be able to vote and hold public office? Well, they would say something like, well, women aren't really made for public life. They're made for private life. They're not really capable of participating in politics or being doctors or lawyers or scientists. And Mill, this is what Mill says, is really, you have to kind of put yourself in the 19th century mindset to appreciate the ingenuity of the argument. But he says, well, okay, so you say women aren't capable. Maybe you're right about that, and maybe you're wrong. Well, suppose you're wrong and they are capable. Well, then you have no right to stop them. But suppose you're right and they're really not capable. Well, then you have no reason to stop them. What are you worried about? Let them try, they'll fail anyway. Of course, we did let them try and they took over. I don't know if you guys know this, but women are dominating at every level of education. So we did give them the opportunity, and they proved more than capable. So be nice to the women in your life. Okay, so Mill was a liberal, an early feminist, and of course, you should mention, because this is the assigned reading, he wrote a book on utilitarianism that's probably still the most important text on the utilitarian moral philosophy, named Utilitarianism. And what he's doing in this book is refining Jeremy Bentham's theory and defending it. And so one of the biggest criticisms of Bentham's theory was that it was a hedonistic theory, that it was, as I said earlier, the doctrine of swine. And Mill, in trying to solve this problem or answer this objection, says, well, you have to kind of understand that there are higher and lower pleasures. And so lower pleasures are the kinds of pleasures that animals and fools can enjoy. You know, sex, drugs, food, that kind of thing. Like pigs and dogs and stupid people enjoy sex and drugs and delicious food just as much as geniuses and highly intelligent people and so on and so forth. So he says those are lower pleasures. But then there are also what he calls higher pleasures, which are like intellectual pleasures, the kinds of pleasures that Socrates would enjoy, the pleasure of philosophy and dialogue and discussion, or the pleasure of literature or poetry or music, which pigs and fools cannot appreciate, but those of us who are educated and refined can. And he says that in our utilitarian calculations, we have to give the higher pleasures more weight than the lower pleasures. And so the joy of reading Shakespeare's Hamlet or listening to Mozart has to count more than the joy of sex or chocolate cake. I had to say, like, I'm not sure if I'm buying this argument, really. Because actually, I'm somebody who really does enjoy music and poetry and philosophy. But if you ask me if it's better than sex or chocolate cake, I'm not so sure. But you can think about that. You got to at least give Mill credit that he understood the objection and he tried to answer it. So, okay, that's John Stuart Mill. Really important. Do the Mill reading from the textbook. I have to mention one last utilitarian philosopher, the contemporary Australian philosopher Peter Singer. Peter Singer has I would say, legitimate claim to being one of the most influential living philosophers, at least moral philosophers. And he's a thoroughgoing utilitarian. In fact, his influence speaks to the enduring influence of Bentham and Mill, that a philosopher as prominent as him is still defending their consequentialist moral theory. And his influence, I would say, has been in two main areas. One is in the area of animal welfare. In the 1970s, maybe 1980s, late 20th century, he wrote an essay called All Animals Are Equal, and later elaborated on that in the book Animal Liberation. And he argued for, well, the liberation of animals. He argued that the way we treat animals is a serious moral wrong. So the animals who are made to suffer in captivity in zoos, the animals who are made to suffer in factory farms, the livestock, the suffering of the livestock, the animals that are made to suffer in laboratories. Well, he regards it as a grave injustice. You can find, I have actually, on Blackboard, you can find Peter Singer's essay, All Animals Are Equal, or you could just Google it. It's easy to find. It's really worth reading, especially if you're interested in ethics or animal welfare at all. He has a very ingenious argument. Like, let's see if I can talk you through this. If you think it's okay to kill a pig so that you can have the pleasure of bacon or sausage, in what sense can that be morally justified? He wants to say, look, meat is murder. That is, the pig was an innocent creature who suffered for your benefit. And you have to weigh the joy you get from bacon against the suffering of the pig. And what he says is the suffering of the pig is so immense that the joy of the bacon can't possibly outweigh it. And I mean, suppose a human being tasted like bacon. Would it be okay to kill him and eat him? Well, clearly not. But you might say, well, there's a moral difference between a human being and a pig. But what is the moral difference between a human being and a pig? The classic answer is, well, human beings are smarter than pigs. But if you think about that, that's not a very good answer. I mean, most human beings are smarter than pigs, but not all of them. Some of them are pretty stupid. Can we kill and eat the stupid people? Well, I mean, clearly not. If we're going to make our moral worth contingent on our intelligence, think about what that would entail. We'll give everybody an IQ test, and the higher you score on the IQ test, the more rights you get. And once your IQ falls below a certain threshold, no rights whatsoever. You see the trouble here. And he points out that the kind of arguments that people give to justify their mistreatment of animals are very much comparable to the kinds of arguments that people used to give for oppressing women and for racism and for sexism. That is, well, why shouldn't women be allowed to vote? Well, because they're not as smart as men. What justifies slavery? Well, you know, Africans are in some way inferior to Europeans. All right, what justifies killing and eating pigs? Well, they're inferior to us human beings. You see, so there's racism and there's sexism, and then Peter Singer adds another word to the mix, speciesism, which is sort of arbitrary discrimination against members of other species. Okay, so luckily we're no longer racists or sexists, but we are still speciesists. We still murder helpless animals for our own pleasure. That's Peter Singer's. Now, whether you agree with Singer or not, you probably don't, which is fine. The thing to notice here is the utilitarian nature of the argument. That is, morality is about reducing suffering, animals can suffer, and therefore animals are worthy of moral consideration. And in some sense, you probably agree with Singer at least a little bit. Like, if I was kicking a soccer ball in my driveway, it wouldn't matter. Or you wouldn't care. But if I was kicking a cat, you would. And if I ask, well, why can I kick a soccer ball and not a cat? It's because the soccer ball can't suffer and the cat can. Okay, so that's, okay. Peter Singer on animal welfare, highly influential. The people for the ethical treatment of animals, the animal welfare people, the animal rights people, they are very fond of Peter Singer. You can understand why. He has very clever arguments in defense of animal rights or animal welfare. The other thing that Peter Singer is really famous for is his campaign against global poverty. And what he says is, in a world where people are suffering and dying from poverty, and this is the case, you have to understand there's hundreds of thousands of people die every year of starvation, thirst, malnutrition, malaria, easily preventable diseases. You can hardly imagine the suffering that exists in the poorest parts of the world if you're fortunate enough not to live in one of them. And what Singer says is that we who are fortunate enough not to live in the poorest parts of the world have a moral obligation to help the people who are. It's funny, I think of Singer and it's like, he says that we should sell all we have and give it to the poor. It's always kind of amusing to me that that in the West, even our atheists are like Christian atheists, you know what I mean? But anyway, I sat down. Singer has a great argument. This one is in the Ethical Life textbook, The Singer Solution to World Poverty. You can find it, you can read it, you should read it. I'll give you a thought experiment that comes from Singer that will give you the idea. He says, imagine that you have a very fancy, expensive pair of shoes. I've asked my students to help me with this, and they've been able to. If you have to spend $1,000 on a pair of shoes, what would you buy? You'd buy. They tell me there's something called you'll forgive me, I'll probably have these names wrong, but like a Louboutins, Red Bottoms, or there used to be, I don't think kids like these anymore, but there used to be something called a Yeezys, or maybe, I don't know, like some kind of fancy Nike Air Jordans, or something like that. So imagine you've got one of these fancy $1,000 pair of sneakers, $1,000 designer shoes, and you're out with your, Louboutin red bottoms or your Yeezys or whatever the $1,000 shoes that are styled today are, and you're walking across campus, and you see some little kid drowning in the pond, and the pond, it's gross, it's full of algae and mud, and you got your shoes laced up really tight so you can't take them off very quickly, and so now you have a dilemma. Oh, and there's nobody else around, and the kid's probably going to die if somebody doesn't wade in and pull him out, and you're the only one around to help. So now you have a dilemma. You could sort of ignore the kid and go on your way and save your brand new $1,000 shoes, or you could wade into the pond, ruin your brand new $1,000 shoes, and save the child. Well, what should you do? Hopefully you all say, well, this is pretty obvious, Mr. G. we would obviously sacrifice the shoes and save the child. And it's like, well, okay, why? What's the reason? It's like, well, the child's life is worth more than the $1,000 pair of shoes. That seems right. But now, what Singer wants you to do is to think that through. Because you could save the life of a child with $1,000. You could save the life of more than one child for $1,000. You could donate $1,000 to Oxfam or the Against Malaria Foundation, or my wife, God bless her, she gives to a charity called Compassion International, sponsors some little girl in Thailand. We don't even miss the money, you know. And like one Christmas, her family bought a rice cooker, you know. And so there are people all over the world dying of starvation and malaria who, if they had like antibiotics and food and water filters, could live. And the money spent on those designer shoes could easily buy those things for them. And if you've all agreed that the kid's life is worth more than the designer shoes, then doesn't it follow logically that there's something morally wrong with buying the designer shoes in the first place, when you could just buy a $50 pair of Bobos that would work just as good and use the remaining $950 to save those starving children? And this is the Singer solution to world poverty, that we should give up our luxury spending, live more modestly, and give our excess wealth away to the people who could benefit from it more. We should sell all we have and give it to the poor. It's a good argument, actually. It's very hard to see what's wrong with it. But now the thing to notice, the utilitarian nature of the argument. That is, we're weighing the pleasure that we get out of the designer clothes against the suffering of the starving children on the other side of the world. And their suffering outweighs our pleasure. And it's impartial. Our happiness doesn't count for any more or any less than the happiness of that child on the other side of the world. Okay, so now hopefully what you're getting here is, first of all, a sense of utilitarianism in the reasoning, but also what I want you to see is the strength of the utilitarian position. The utilitarian theory is a very democratic theory, it's a very egalitarian theory, it's a very progressive theory, it's a very humanitarian theory. The utilitarians, like Jeremy Bentham, were among the first abolitionists. Like John Stuart Mill, were among the first feminists. Like Peter Singer, were among the first real animal welfare advocates of the 20th century. Always sort of progressive, forward-looking moral thinkers ahead of their time, always advocates for the poor, always advocates for the downtrodden, the meek. And so, yeah, it's a democratic, egalitarian, progressive moral theory. All right, good. That's good. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to make a second video where I give you the criticism of the theory. But by now you should at least understand, be able to define and describe the theory and say something intelligent in defense of it.